All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Josh Cowen. I'm an education policy expert based at Michigan State University, and until May, I also have a visiting role at a litigation group called the Education Law Center. I won't recite each of my other credentials. For the purposes of this hearing, I'll just simply say three things. I've been studying vouchers and school choice more generally for 20 years. I used to be optimistic about the way that smaller versions of bills like this could be part of a targeted solution to some shortcomings in education policy. But over the last decade, I changed my mind as vouchers caused some of the worst academic results in the history of the field. I've read HB3 and its companion bill in your Senate, and I recognize its language is similar to bills introduced all over the country. To level set, I need to tell you that all education savings accounts are vouchers, although not all vouchers are ESAs, and I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about the difference. The private school tuition piece of this bill is a voucher. The rest of them are add-ons. Although I applaud what I truly believe are good faith attempts to address shortcomings in other state bills, I still see little in the current language to avoid three key problems that we see in other states. First, and this has come up all throughout the day, in today's form, these bills prioritize the rights of private schools over the rights of parents. They give the schools the choice, not school choice for kids and families. Second, and related, please know that eligibility isn't the same as access. Although I truly applaud the eligibility criteria laid out in this bill for students from lower income families and those with disabilities. Without meaningful provisions to compel or at least incentivize private providers to admit those children, the take-up rate is going to be very, very different than the eligibility criteria laid out in the bill among Texas families. It's going to reflect wealthier and disproportionately white families and those already in private school. This is something we have seen in every single other state that's passed a bill like this. The third piece is, and this is the part that I think we're all talking about today here in this hearing, only about a quarter of kids who use funds like this in other states were ever in public schools to begin with. For them, a typical school receiving these dollars that focusing on these transfers from public to private school are not the elite private school providers of Hollywood lore or some of the marketing that we've all seen set before us around this bill and others like it. They're what I call subprime providers. They're often financially distressed. And that's why voucher results over the last decade, as I changed my mind and when the data changed, over the last decade, we've seen learning loss associated with some of these bills on par with what COVID-19 did to test scores more recently, or what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores. It's that bad. It's been since 2013 that a study has shown that vouchers improve educational attainment. I know because I wrote it. It's been since 2002 since a study showed that vouchers improved test scores for children. I know because I was a young graduate student assisting with that study. Bigger and the more recent the voucher system, the worse the results have been. There's no dispute about that, not in the previous witness testimony, not in the data we're looking at too. The only difference is how well we should weigh old pilot studies from the 1990s versus more large-scale studies over the last few years. What about parent satisfaction? Parents should have the first and the last say when it comes to their child's schooling. But the question before this committee isn't really about that. It's about how to spend taxpayer dollars, at least as I understand it, and whether to do so in a way that puts the interest of the private schools ahead of parents. A pro-parent version of this bill would require private schools taking taxpayer cash as payment to offer open admissions, or at least administer the state exam, because that way all parents could truly choose those private schools, and just as importantly, they'd be able to compare apples to apples the results of that choice, which they can't do in the current bill. So just to sum up sort of my concerns with this, I'm very worried about that parents are potentially being sold a bit of a bill of goods by the schools that they might be searching out for. That's not to say they're all bad actors in the system, not at all. In fact, the vast majority of private schools, the vast majority of public schools are all trying to do what's best for kids and families. The problem is what do we do to allow parents actual choice if we're going to go down this road? And unfortunately, the language in this bill really does center the needs of the private schools and the choice of the private schools over parents. So I'm happy to take questions as well, and I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much for your testimony. Members, are there questions for these witnesses?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Cowen, thank you for being here. I want to ask about your testimony versus the testimony we heard from Ed Choice, the organization, the Milton Friedman organization we heard from earlier, because they seem to contradict what you've said about the results. They pointed to a bunch of studies and states showing that vouchers are great for everyone. They're great for private school kids, they're great for public school kids. So can you explain why your testimony is different from Ed Choice's testimony?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Representative. I'm not sure that, again, I don't think there's any disagreement about the catastrophic academic results over the last decade. At least those studies are present in the list that Ed Choice circulates and that has been cited here. The question, I think, here is how do we weigh more recent results from much larger statewide voucher systems like in Indiana, like in Ohio, like in DC, and especially like in Louisiana nearby, over the last few years against studies from very small pilot programs from the 1990s. And so the way that Ed Choice counts its studies is it just dumps them all in together and it says it's what's called the vote counting method. It's does it show positive results or negative results, and we just add it all up. The field generally would disagree with the way that they add the studies up, and they would sort of say, we're going to prioritize the more recent and the larger studies. The meta-analyses referred to in that testimony also include international programs. So it is true that when you include international voucher systems, which are very, very differently structured, when you include international studies in these meta-analyses, the results tend to bump up to a positive level, or at least a small positive level. But the extent to which the preponderance of the research shows positive results for vouchers entirely depends on whether you include international studies. That is to say, all of the results from the US over the last decade have been negative. The international studies have been more favorable. Another way to think about this, this may sound like a lot of very technical sort of scientific arguments between a couple of researchers, or another way to think about this. The Ed Choice list also double and triple counts studies. So as an example, so I mentioned that the last study to show that vouchers improved test scores for kids who actually used them to transfer from public to private school came in 2002. And I was part of that as a young, I'm saying height, it had nothing to do with height, but I was a 20-something graduate student at the time working as an RA on that study. That was one study, not 3 studies, but Ed Choice counts it as 3 studies because it contained sites and data from New York City, Dayton, and Washington, D.C. That's one paper that was subjected to one set of results. That's not actually what happens when you kind of go out and look at the data. Many, many more kids have been harmed academically by vouchers than have ever been hurt by them, and that harm has come more recently. And so really this entire debate comes down to whether you think that a positive study for 400 kids using vouchers in 1995 should be counted the same as a negative study from Louisiana that harmed several thousands of children academically in 2018 or 2019. And I and the field would tell you we weigh the Louisiana results from 2018 for thousands of children much more heavily than the tiny results from 400 students in 1995, and that's the debate, I think.
That's very helpful. There was also testimony earlier that all the news out of Arizona is misunderstood and that things are going very well there. Have you spent any time studying what's happened in Arizona, and can you shed any light on that for us?
So the Arizona results have really come down to whether the investigative reporting, the capital area reporting, the journalists working on and study and writing about that voucher system there, as well as the Brookings Institution, which has sort of been the independent arbiter, as well as a number of neutral think tanks, all have sort of said these results are coming in way over budget, are costing millions of dollars over what we expected, and in particular, disproportionately benefiting wealthy families. That is a pattern, by the way, that has also been shown more recently in Florida. It is true that the voucher advocacy community has released its own studies to try to counter that. And at the end of the day, you just sort of have to weigh this as whether you think that sort of the results behind the groups that are organized to support these bills and spread them across the country should be weighed in the same way as the journalists covering the story in Arizona or independent think tanks. And I take the latter side of this and just in terms of quality control, but I haven't actually done data analysis on Arizona myself.
Last question. If, based on all of your research and the data that you've collected, if we wanted to pass a voucher bill here in Texas, what would you urge us to do to make sure that bill serves the students that the proponents of the bill claim they want to serve?
Let's just take the first couple eligibility categories as an example, which again, I think that's as I read it, a good faith sort of placement and prioritization in the bill of those categories, students with disabilities and those from lower income families. My question would be, what happens to the dollars when a child cannot find admission to their preferred school if they're in that top eligibility category? Do those dollars get moved down the criteria list to the next eligible kids? Or do they get repurposed into general fund, or perhaps even sent into the school aid, or what we call in my state the school aid fund? I don't know off the top of my head what you call it, the public education fund. What I would do is say, and again, I take the position that we just haven't seen a universal bill yet, or a general purpose voucher bill yet that has shown good results, at least not in the last decade. So it's hard for me to get my head around the idea that there would be such a bill, but taking your question seriously, what would I like to see to make it better? I would require private schools that are willing to take the taxpayer cash to use the state exam, to offer open admissions, and if a special needs child, a disability child in particular, was unable to use it as they were ranked at the top of the eligibility list, I would find a way in the bill to repurpose the dollars back into general fund or back into the public school system, as opposed to just sort of holding it there or moving it down the list to wealthier families.
I know I said last question. This is my real last question. I've been very suspicious of non-Texans coming to testify at our committee. There have been a lot of them recently.
Sure.
Despite what your form said, you're not from Texas.
No, sir.
Why are you here testifying in front of us on this issue?
Yeah, you know, I might as well answer the question by asking why have I been in a lot of other states talking about this issue. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I and others sort of who had been looking at this stuff thought we were kind of done talking about vouchers. The results that I've mentioned over the last decade were so bad that for those of us who sort of committed ourselves to what was called evidence-based education policy, like we're going to try to follow the data, we had all sort of just kind of decided, I guess we're moving on from vouchers. Clearly they don't work by any standard we've ever seen in the expert community. These things don't work. Let's go find other ways to improve education for kids and families. And that's not what happened. Right? So I can tell you the exact day, not the exact day, but it was March of 2022, so 3 years ago, that I really started to get active in this space as an expert talking about it. And I got a call from NBC News asking me to comment on a bill that was floating around very similar to this one in another state. And I hadn't been following the news a lot. You know, we're coming out of COVID. I was dealing with some medical stuff, and it was just like, what are we talking about? Like, didn't this end? The results were so bad. Why are we still having this conversation? And it turns out that horrific learning loss wasn't enough to stop these bills, and I had dedicated the last 20 years of my career to the idea that data and evidence should inform education policy, particularly toward the question of what's best for kids and families. And how do we make education better for kids and families, particularly those who've been perhaps ill-served by the public education system? How do we make it better? Everything I've been working on over the last 20 years on this issue would tell me that these bills are really bad, and yet here they are. And so that was enough to kind of get me talking about this and using what I knew to try to kind of explain and what I knew. And I also think, just as an aside, as I said, I started this, I started fairly agnostic about the structure of aid to these kids and families, and that included 20 years ago vouchers. And so I do think, I've been part of a lot of studies that 20 years ago showed some decent stuff, and the data changed. And if I was talking about it 20 years ago or 15 years ago, saying these results were okay for kids, I feel like I owed it both to myself and to the kids and families we were talking about to say otherwise when the results changed, and that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cowen, during your testimony, I believe I heard this correctly, you referenced that only 1/4 of students were ever, I think you said in public schools, but would you repeat that and flesh it out?
Yeah, in all the states that reported data on this question, only roughly about 1 in 4 kids were ever in public school who used vouchers. The rest had either never been in public school because they were kindergartners, or more commonly were coming into the voucher system from a private school.
And what are the implications of that?
Well, there's 2 implications. One is that these are new costs to the state, and in the long run, no state yet has been able to afford 2 education systems. These are new dollars the state's obligating itself to, those kids who are already in private school. And then the other question is, you worry that even within the private sector, you set up 2 sets of tiers of education, the schools that are oversubscribed, the really good high-quality providers that are oversubscribed, that are serving kids who are already in private schools there in the first place, and then the ones that are under-enrolled chronically may close without the voucher bailout. And those are the ones that tend to serve the kids that are transferring in large numbers from the public to private school, and those are the ones that we see have been really driving those negative results for kids.
Thank you.
Chairman Frank.
Yeah, thank you very much, and appreciate you being here. I've got a question.
Sure.
Is it Dr. Cowen or Mr. Cowen?
Either is fine with me, sir.
Okay, well, no, I think that finding unbiased testing or tests or studies is very, very, very challenging, and
Sure.
I think you're right to be concerned about unbiasedness. I do look. I think you said you're with the Education Law Center, and
Sure.
just a quick look makes me think that you are not agnostic at all in,
Sure.
in yours. That's
Not anymore,
Seems
sir,
to be
no.
that seems to be the purpose of that is to go about defeating it. So I think it's important to say that there may not be agnostic may not be quite the word. So I want to ask, because you've talked about what's happened with kids who have taken the scholarships. I think they're just ESAs, but anyway, what happens to existing public school students from
Yeah.
all the test data? I think I've heard you talk about it before.
Yeah, this is a good question. So this is one area of agreement between the previous witness and I. So it is true that if we take seriously the results from the research community, there's about 4. I dispute the quality of some of the studies cited by EdChoice, but there are about 4 high-quality studies that show that for vulnerable communities, particularly in Florida, who were threatened with funding loss, their academic results, these are the public schools where funding loss due to vouchers was threatened in those communities, they did show what are called competitive effects academically. Those results in the sort of the most recent version of that study are very small. They range something equivalent to moving the average child from the 50th percentile to the 50.2 percentile. Okay. For a 10% increase in voucher funding. To put that in perspective, that's about 3 times less the academic payoff for a 10% increase in just direct funding to those communities themselves. And it's about 10 times less than the negative effect of moving from a public school to a voucher school using a voucher for the kids from some of those same communities. So it does exist, that competitive positive effect. It's think of it as moving from an F to a D for one of those sort of under-resourced communities. But it's tiny.
Okay, and it's really not, I mean, there's not a funding loss threatened. There is a perception of a funding loss, but because these funds are coming
the
from
results are
separate-
only apparent in the communities pardon me, the results are only apparent actually in the communities with the highest funding loss associated because of vouchers.
Okay.
So you can't, another way to think about this is you can't claim funding neutrality and competitive effects at the same time. Only one of the two can be true. And the answer is, in my view, that there are these tiny competitive effects, but they come only because those public schools have lost some dollars.
Okay, so the idea that they're going to struggle is, I guess there's actually a slight uptick, be it slight, with the public school students.
It's a slight uptick.
Okay.
With the same dollars, it's 3 times lower than the impact of directly investing. So you have to sort of decide if you think that's a loss or not. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Vice Chair Bernal.
Thank you. I just want to, Mr. Cowen, Dr. Cowen, we know each other,
We do.
but we didn't realize that.
No, it's been 28 years or something like
That's
that.
right. So I want to focus on 2 things. One is, I will,
Just-
I will. So I want to talk about this idea, I want to go back to this agnostic piece. Because what I think you said was you started off agnostic, and then the research led you to take a certain position,
Yes.
right? And so
I mean, the record shows I'm the author of 2 studies that show positive results for vouchers. They're
Right.
just more than a decade old. Yeah.
Right, so you started off thinking that they might be okay, and
Yeah.
then over time,
Yeah.
the data had you change your mind, or
Yes, sir.
caused you to change your mind. And that must be why you teach at Michigan State now, which is the enemy, right?
So we knew each other at the University of Michigan, just the chief athletic rival to, yeah.
I was his RA.
He was. We just realized this. Yeah. 1997, sir.
Stop that.
Yeah, it's not a comfortable place to be in, if I'm honest. I mean, the easy part about it though is that the results really are very clear, and they're clear as far as it's like sometimes we know what's going on, and in this case we know what's going on. It's very simple. It's the voucher idea is just yet another policy idea, and I also in other public commentary have said that there's not a lot about this bill that's particularly not this bill particularly, but the idea that's very different than any other policy area. And one of those things is that it becomes very, very difficult to scale fairly radical new ideas. And this is whether they come from progressives, liberals, the left, the right. And this is just one of those ideas that like worked when you're talking about a handful, several hundred kids in a Milwaukee, maybe in a Cleveland, maybe even in Washington, D.C. more recently. It's just that, and that was because there was the capacity in those cities with a handful of private schools hand-recruited by advocates of these organizations that were really good schools to come in and make good faith efforts to take those kids, educate them, and work with them. The difference, though, between then and now is that now we're past the trial stage. So if I may, think of it this way. Imagine that 30 years ago, in clinical trials, a vaccine showed small positive health effects for kids to whom that vaccine was administered. And then more recently, when that vaccine was taken out of the lab and given to the general population over the counter or even the prescription, so not for a few hundred kids using the vaccine, but several thousands upon thousands of kids using the vaccine, the health effects became negative and in some cases even atrocious. Like none of us would say, most of us wouldn't, I wouldn't say, well, the pilot studies 30 years ago showed positive effects, so let's just ignore all the negative health effects of the kids when we scaled it up in the general population. Let's just hang our hat on the pilot laboratory settings. Like none of us would say that if it was a medicine, but that's kind of the logic of the way the studies have gone when it comes to vouchers is let's focus on the results 30 years ago when you and I were in college together instead of 8 years ago or 6 years ago.
Right, thank you so much for reminding me that I'm almost 50. But I want to, so to that point, I want to get to this other piece because I don't want it to end up on a 3-second YouTube clip or Instagram
Sure.
clip or a tweet. And that is that when you talked about the uptick
Yeah.
that existed, you're saying the uptick only existed after a significant defunding of the public schools. So the uptick looked like this.
That's the
It's not
competitive.
this, it's
So the distinction between the analogy I just drove with the laboratory results, that's the kids who use vouchers to go to a private school. The tiny uptick that you're asking about now and that Representative Frank asked about is what's called the competitive effect, the impact of introducing vouchers threatening funding loss to public schools and the tiny uptick on kids in those public schools who remain.
And then one last question. There was a conversation about special needs children and the schools that can or are willing to serve them. And there's an idea, a thought, maybe even a hope that if we were to do this, that the natural consequence of that would be that there are more schools that open and more options that are made available to them because the voucher exists. I don't know whether that's true or not, and I'm wondering if your research has told you anything about whether or not that phenomenon happens or if it doesn't.
It hasn't happened yet. The most successful voucher systems generally have been the ones that are very, very precisely targeted to students with special needs and only students with special needs, particularly for to attend the types of providers that were discussed in previous testimony, say a school that specializes in hard of hearing or severe autism or something like that. What has happened is that you do get what are called pop-up schools, kind of fly-by-night schools that come and flood the zone, flood the market when you do introduce these dollars. This is, again, a phenomenon that happens across different policy areas. It's not specific to education. Public dollars turn on, and all of a sudden, everybody has a service they're going to provide on the public dime. That's what happens in the education space, too, when vouchers come to town with these pop-up schools. They are also helping to drive, by the way, those negative results. So they're not these classic academies that have been around for 20 years serving kids. It's hard to run a school. As anyone here probably in this room can tell you, it's expensive to run a school if you're doing it the right way. And what happens is these pop-up schools don't often survive very long in the market. So they come in, they're there for 2 or 3 years, and then they close down, leaving a lot of these kids they promised to help stranded. The schools that have been in place for a long time before vouchers turn on, they don't tend to close as frequently, usually because they're better at what they do. So if we're talking about kind of the market and as it expands, is again usually these kind of pop-ups, and those are the ones that I worry a bit about. Yeah.
I appreciate that. It's good to see you, Dr. Cowen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Been a while.
Representative Hinojosa.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Cowen, one of the enviable, and I say this, I hesitate to say this, one of the enviable rights and policies, rights of students and children in Florida is they have a constitutional right to a class size. Did you know that?
I did not. No.
So the people of Florida passed a constitutional amendment to require that class sizes in 2002, I believe, don't get above a certain, for elementary, it's 22 kids, right? Which is a safeguard against any kind of experimenting that we're doing in the general population that we don't have. It would be wonderful if our kids and our teachers had that kind of constitutional right, because what we see in Texas is the opposite happens, where as funds become more and more strained, we have larger and larger class sizes. And that's been my experience and the experience of countless Texas school kids. So I just want to point that out, that perhaps that is one of the safeguards that's in the Florida system that we should consider if we're going to do something like that here in Texas, because in Texas we waive class size requirements without exception all the time in this state.
Thank you.
One of the things that we heard when we considered this legislation last session, or one of the special sessions, I don't remember, or maybe it was in the interim when we had a hearing on vouchers. I get them confused because there have been so many. We had a panel of pro-voucher experts, and they agreed with all of them. They all agreed that the only time they found studies revealing positive impacts for students who used the voucher was when the private school could discriminate in its admissions policy. They were all in agreement on that. Has that been your experience?
It's been my experience that the best providers as measured by test scores are the ones that also carefully screen their admissions. Yeah. So, the theory of change here is that if you provide public subsidies to the providers that can handpick their students, that there'll be some sort of match between provider and student and parent that sort of clicks for everyone, and the educational outcomes will show that. The problem is, the flip side of that is that there is this admission denial. And the other thing I want to say, because it hasn't come up yet before, but just to sort of stress this point, we've had a lot of conversation, or I've heard a lot of conversation today about the admissions side of things, whether or not the private schools are admitting all students, or at least not formally discriminating against certain students. Like, no private school that I've ever walked into, and I've walked into a lot, puts a sign on their door that says we discriminate. Right. There's just a lot of different ways to go about doing this, right? And to just say, the match isn't for us. And the bill explicitly, in this case, allows the private schools to just simply say, either whether it's for religious purposes, or there's a phrase in this bill that I haven't seen in the other state bills. It may be there and I've just missed it, but educational mission. I'm not sure if the school's choosing to turn a child down specifically because of its educational mission instead of its religious preferences, what exactly that entails, other than perhaps students with disability. But the other thing I just really want to stress here is that a lot of the selection that we see in voucher systems, including in Indiana, which got talked about a lot earlier by a previous witness, has come by push-out, or by formal and informal expulsion, or by just sort of a softer asking a child to leave. Private schools have gotten very good in other states, like Wisconsin, for example, where I've spent a lot of time studying and writing. Private schools have gotten very good understanding that, the model, the educational model, some would say, I don't know if I go this far, but some would say they're gaming the system for the state. Some would others say their model is, we're going to take as many kids as we have room for, and then we're going to kind of figure out who fits and ask the ones who don't to leave. Either way, the net result is this. Students who leave voucher systems across the board, whether it's mid-year or in between school years, tend to be lower scoring on the exams that are administered. They tend to be more likely to be students of color. They tend to be more likely to be students with disability, and they tend to be more likely to be students with lower levels of income, even among a lower income population of users. So I just want to stress to the committee that the school's choice, the school's choosing the kids, doesn't just come at the admissions process, which is often fairly open and good faith. It also comes in the middle of the school year and between school years, as the schools start to screen out the match and those kids go back to public school.
You bring up a good point, and it reminds me, in the bill, there is a section in the bill that requires a report to be done on the program, but it only is looking at the demographics of the students who are accepted. It should also include the demographics of the students who are rejected and who are expelled.
That would be my preference, yes.
Chairman Dutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You reminded me of something, and I've had this thinking. The University Interscholastic League has a lot to do with where athletes who are in certain schools and dictate where they can play and when they transfer schools, whether they're eligible or not. This bill, as I've looked at it, doesn't speak to that at all. Is there a concern about, some of these private schools taking away the superior athletes from other schools, for example?
That's not a question that's come up in the research community, Representative, but it certainly, you could imagine a world where there's recruitment going on, and that does happen in the public sector too. In my state, we don't have vouchers, but 1 in 4 kids in my state go to either a charter school or use the state's vast open enrollment system to transfer between districts, and you do see a lot of recruitment going on in that way. So I wouldn't anticipate any different on that note here.
So should the bill speak to that at all, or should we limit the ability? Well, just should we speak to it at all?
I don't know if you have thoughts on this. Without diminishing the importance of the question, Representative, in a world where there's lots of concerns about this bill, the athlete recruitment, it didn't occur to me, and I need to think about it a little bit. But it certainly would be something we should think about and talk further about, I think.
I think it's a fair question, Representative, and it brings us back to the point that our public schools are the schools that serve all students, that create the most opportunities for all different students, whether they are athletes or musicians or artists or students with disabilities or students with language access needs, right? And so that should really be, I don't know if adding UIL protections to this bill is going to address the global concern, right? That a voucher program just doesn't serve all students in Texas.
Well, or should the UIL be able to dictate even if the student accesses a voucher?
I don't think I can speak to that, sir.
You what?
I don't think I can speak to that one, sir.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Schoolcraft.
Dr. Cowen, what's the trend in participation in the school choice program in Florida? Is it growing or shrinking?
I believe it's growing as a dollar contribution, and I believe that the data still show that the vast majority of users with that bill are coming from private schools. So it's a take-up among the private subsidy, yeah,
So participation is growing.
among private school students.
Well, they've been going for 20 years. They're going to run out of private school students at
Yeah,
some point. But, yeah, it's
the-
still growing.
Yeah.
And, all right. And we've talked a lot, you talked a lot about the private schools and what's happening with trends. What's been the trend in results that we're getting from the public education systems throughout the country over the last 10 or 15 years?
On what measure, sir?
Well, let's say the NAEP measure, the
Yeah.
Nation's Report. I believe it's shown a pretty consistent trend down for the last 10 or 15 years. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
I certainly take the position that we can do better across the board when it comes to academic outcomes, regardless of the sector we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman Ashby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cowen, your comments about I think you called them pop-up actors or bad actors, I call them fly-by-nights. I share that concern, and so my question is, when you look at other states that have implemented the ESA program, are there any particular safeguards from a policy perspective that we could put in the bill to prevent that?
Yeah, there's borrowing from what states do already with charter schools, and different states do vary widely in how they think about charter schools in this space. But one of the things we know from the charter school research literature is that the schools that do pop up that can make it for 3 years or more tend to be substantially more effective than those who can't, just if you're comparing those who would eventually close or not. So one thing that I would do in this case, for example, is consider whether or not an eligible provider of private school services under this bill could only serve students under this bill if they'd been in existence for more than 3 years, for example. That would at least eliminate part of the problem with the pop-up schools here, if you sort of restricted providers to that duration of existence.
Great, thank you.
Well, I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Dutton.
And you raised this point. Is there any incentive for charter schools to become private schools?
I'd have to look at the dollar for dollar figure, what the incentive structure here in Texas would be, and it's not off the top of head occurring to me. What I can tell you is that in other states, you've seen it go both ways. So charter schools converting to private schools and private schools converting to charter schools, and it really just depends on what, listen, I mean, private school, charter schools, whatever non-traditional publicly funded schools are usually responding to the incentives that legislators give them, whether it's to work with certain children, whether it's to convert to certain status or administratively. So, that would be something that would be an open question here under this legislation.
Well, the reason I ask is I was trying to look through the bill, and I was just wondering if collectively the benefits in this bill create an incentive for charter schools to become private schools.
That has happened in other states, sir.
And it could happen here.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Representative Hinojosa. You're back on the list.
Question as Representative Dutton.
Wow, how y'all doing? That's good.
Great minds.
All right, so we got a twofer there. All right, yeah. Representative Leo Wilson.
Dr. Cohen, you're not currently doing research, correct?
I'm not doing empirical evaluations of voucher systems, no.
Okay. Have you ever been like the principal investigator on a longitudinal study on vouchers?
I've been the principal investigator of a number of school choice evaluations across the country, including Research and Development Center funded by the U.S. Department of Education while Betsy DeVos was secretary, and that included voucher systems in Louisiana as well as other states.
Okay. And you currently are with, what-
I'm currently in Michigan State University. I'm on a one-year fellowship with the Education Law Center that ends on May 16th.
okay, so you're currently at Michigan State?
Yeah, I'm on what's called
Oh, okay, I
distinguished
thought you
leave,
were
if we're
with
going to
the
be technical about it.
Education Law Center.
Yeah, if we're, the way it works with these university positions, leave is available, and I've taken what's called distinguished leave to do a one-year fellowship at the Education Law Center. I will be
Okay.
back teaching in the fall at Michigan State University.
Okay, and aren't they, isn't that center closely affiliated with teacher unions? Isn't that mainly how it's supported?
I haven't seen the 990, ma'am, but they certainly receive contributions from the teacher unions, that's correct.
Okay, and, okay. Thank you.
Representative Schoolcraft.
Dr. Cowan, your concern about pop-up schools, maybe there's different laws in the states you've looked at, but earlier this morning, we had some testimony about the accreditation process we have in Texas for private schools. And this bill will only fund or make eligible accredited schools. The testimony was it takes as much as 2 years. It's very comprehensive, looks at financial status, physical facilities, faculty, the whole thing. So with that kind of provisions in Texas, would that make you a little less concerned about pop-ups?
If not knowing the ins and outs of that accreditation process, if it's as you're describing, that would certainly help. In other states, some of the accreditation processes can be completed in as little as a week. And what we've seen in places like Wisconsin, actually, is that some of the voucher advocacy organizations have applied to and been granted the ability under the state, from the State Department of Education, to become accreditors. And what they've done is actually offered these quick certs, these quick accreditations to the pop-up schools to kind of clear that hurdle and start operating in the market, often within weeks of opening their doors. And so it is a real issue. Now, if it really is a 2-year process, that would extend into the 2-year problem, and that would minimize perhaps some of these pop-up schools we've talked about.
I'd say more than perhaps. I don't think it's fair to judge what we have in Texas by some of those other states. So let's look at what the actual accreditation process is. Thank you.
Representative Hinojosa.
Dr. Cowen, did you know that the private schools testified last time we heard vouchers that they had never once terminated accreditation for any of their private schools under their review process?
I did not know that, no.
Thank you.
Yeah, Representative Leo Wilson.
I just have one more. When you do like a longitudinal evaluation or a study, would you do it for more than 2 years? Like, how long are those?
So a couple of things. So all of the longitudinal evaluations of school choice programs, of which I've been a part of, either in a leadership role or as a young data analyst, you would hope to do it for at least 3 and often as much as 4 to 5 years. Unfortunately, no current voucher bill since 2020 has provided for that kind of longitudinal evaluation. And I take the position that one of the reasons for that has been that the results of those longitudinal evaluations up to and including the 4th and 5th years have shown negative results.
Well, because I'm looking at one that you did, the Annenberg working paper, I guess that you co-authored, something that you did. It was like a 2-year span where you were talking about test scores being 0.15 below the standard deviation. Do you remember this?
I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. Can you tell me the title of the paper?
It was an Annenberg working paper that you co-authored.
I've co-authored a lot of papers, ma'am.
Okay.
Can you tell me which one?
It was a DC, the program was a DC Opportunity Scholarship Program.
I have not written a DC Opportunity Scholarship paper published by the Annenberg Institute, ma'am.
Okay, it said that you co-authored it on here, but it did cover 2 years, and it only was for math, but it said that it, that they found that the scores were a negative 0.15 and
So the official evaluation of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program that was the most recent one available was published, its last version was published right before COVID-19 hit. It was a 3-year study. In the first 2 years, they showed substantial negative results. I think that must be what you're talking about, negative
Right.
0.15 roughly. That's about 2/3 of the negative learning loss that COVID caused itself. By the 3rd year, the average test scores of recipients into that program had flattened out, but that was partly driven by the fact that low performers in the program had exited out and returned to public schools. So it's not indicative of program growth, it's indicative of lower performing kids exiting out from the program, as I've explained with some of the other studies that have shown that.
okay, but 3 years would be better than the 2 when you're looking
But
at that, right?
yes, ma'am,
And that showed
absolutely.
that the test scores were like evened out.
But that study was a 3-year study.
Okay, and at the end of that 3-year study, I mean, they said that the scores had evened out, but in this other paper that supposedly you co-authored, it said that it only took the first 2 years in which it said that it had a negative decline, and the negative was in math only. But you would want to look at the 3 years, since it was a 3-year study, is my point, not report on what it was after 2 years. But you don't remember co-authoring it.
So I just haven't co-authored a paper from the Annenberg Institute that evaluated the DC voucher program, but there was an evaluation of the DC voucher program that was done officially for Congress that was authorized by the Trump administration that showed 2 of the first 3 years were negative, up to about negative 0.15. And it is true that the 3rd year, and I've always talked about that program as 2 of the 3 years. So the 3rd year was flat when you talk about the averaging test scores of recipients. That's not the same thing as saying that for the kids who suffered learning loss as a result of using the voucher, they finally made up ground. What it is saying is that the average test scores of stayers in the program balanced out the negative learning loss of the kids who left the program. We don't really have a statistical way to adjust for that even in randomized control trials. We have a way to what's called bound the results, but the best way to describe that program is that in 2 of the 3 years, the results were negative.
Okay, thank you.
Members, any more questions? Just briefly, I have a copy here of the study. It says Annenberg Institute at Brown,
Yeah.
Bruce Baker and Derek Black, Josh Callan, Jennifer Jennings, Preston Green. Is that you?
That's us.
Okay.
But
so-
that's not
so-
a study of the DC voucher program. We're just describing the results in that paper.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's different. So you describe other people's studies, you don't do your own research? Is that what this, I mean, I'm not, is that what this is then? You're
That-
looking at data and then making an interpretation, but you didn't really do the study?
I have done many, many studies of voucher systems, sir, since 2002, whether as a graduate student or as a principal investigator. That particular paper, which is very recently written, does describe the results of the field. Yes, sir.
Okay. So it sounds like your journey here, you started out agnostic, right?
Yeah.
You were just kind of middle of the road, academic data guy, right? I mean,
Trying to be.
Seriously, no, yeah.
No, for real.
And at some point, for whatever reason, that changed. And we look at that. So I guess what I'm saying is, and I'm not a scientist,
Yeah.
but, when we look at this, and we take, especially kids that would be in public school and may take an option, a parent decided they would want to take a different path. Do you sort of solve for the fact that sometimes maybe those kids were having significant struggles? In other words, in that, you take a kid in a public school environment where, let's say it's been less than optimal.
Yeah.
And they go to a private school environment. Never attended a private school, never had a kid in a private school. I've been in one a couple times, that's about it. But what could we say, in the same way that we evaluate our public schools, that we see sort of mixed results on an individual child's journey back.
Yeah.
And those can be different, because you see cohorts of kids that I know that go to private school or been in public school and gone to private school that do very, very well.
Yeah.
It's interesting that only kids that are involved in this are the ones that don't thrive. Maybe I hope I'm asking the question correctly. Is that,
Well,
is that the cohort you look at?
So the kids that I'm particularly concerned about when it comes to these voucher systems, and I take the position that we need to do a lot better across the board at all sectors of education, whether it's on NAEP or anything else. My concern is exactly for the kids who do look at the voucher system, or their parents who do look at the voucher in front of them, and because perhaps they haven't been as well served as we would want, or as their parents would like, from the public school that they're in, for whatever reason,
Yeah.
whether it's test scores, whether it's reading, whatever it is. And they look at the school and they say, well, the school is telling me I can have it all. They're gonna take my kid for whoever the kid is. They're going to provide perhaps some of the things that I don't see in the public school. Spent a lot of years studying this issue as a young researcher in Milwaukee, and we used to visit a lot of these private schools, excuse me, and you'd walk in, you see these banners, and the banners would say, and public schools have them too, and they would say, discipline, character, Christ-centered education, and then they'd say something like world-class education too, as I get on the fourth thing, and parents are like, yes, that's what I want. My concern is that last piece. Is the schools are promising these things, and the academic results, that last piece, have tended to be something far less than what the marketing to those parents is for. And so the parents who are leaving public schools, perhaps for a good reason, or at least the assumption is this has not done what I have asked the public school to do. I think this voucher is going to give me a better shot. The school's telling me it's going to give me a better shot. They're waving some test score numbers that I can't compare to the public school that I'm in, but they seem pretty good. And I'm going to go and I'm going to enter that school. And what happens to those children, those are the very kids that suffer the learning loss we're talking about. It's not the kids who've been in private school long-term who've already been there. It's the kids precisely because of these longitudinal studies that Representative Wilson asked about. We can track their progress from public to private school as they transfer. I was author of a study in Milwaukee, for example, that followed the kids into voucher systems from public school and then back out of the voucher system into public school. And what we found is that the kids transferring from public to private school tended to be some of the lower performers in that public system in Milwaukee, so perhaps they weren't as well served. They went into the voucher system. They did, in that particular case, they didn't particularly suffer a long-term academic harm, but they weren't performing as well as the other voucher kids in that school, and they exited back out where they ended up growing again academically. But they were still among the lowest performers in those private schools. So my concern here, just to sort of tie this all up, is that when you're talking about the kids who leave public schools for whatever reason because they're looking for something different, we have to find a way to make sure that when they're doing that, especially when they're doing that on the public dime, they're getting what the school is actually promising them. And the results, at least over the last decade, have shown that hasn't been true, at least as far as test scores are concerned.
But it did, and sir, it did work up until like 2013.
2013, 14, yeah.
That was promising. So there was something different
It
about
wasn't-
that time period.
it wasn't hurting
I mean,
them
just
academically.
as far as the data.
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
pop-up
that's right.
schools? Is it?
That,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
I'm just,
no,
I find that interesting. That it sort of fell off the cliff in 2013.
Yeah, 2013, 14 is, so there was a period of time between, the history lesson here is from about 2004, 5 to 2013, 14, we didn't see any results either way. Wasn't these big academic gains, but at least we weren't seeing the losses that I'm describing. It just was kind of neutral. And then you could kind of pivot the conversation. This was sort of the era of No Child Left Behind, right? Kind of getting its sea legs and things like that. So test scores were the coin of the realm at that time. And we weren't seeing a lot of differences academically in the voucher systems one way or the other. And then 2014, 2015 happened. Louisiana happened. Indiana happened. DC happened. Ohio happened. And we saw, we're not just talking about little test score drops. We're talking about some of the worst we've ever seen on any research question in the history of education research. And so it kind of was a jaw-dropping moment. Like, what happened here? And for some of us, it was enough to say, this isn't working. We've canceled other promising education reforms for far less negative results. Sometimes we've canceled them for not working at all, but not moving the needle up or down. It's very, very rare in education research to see something that harmed kids academically. You have to go to COVID-19. You have to go to what Katrina did. You just don't find negative results. You just find a lot of flat results, no impact whatsoever. So it really was 2014-15, but that's the year that these things became statewide systems as opposed to these highly targeted programs.
Well, could we say that Louisiana overregulated their system? In other words, they took a private school and tried to make them into a little mini public. And they said, you got to take the state test, you got to teach the state curriculum, and imported all those things there. That's what I've read.
It's certainly true.
And they've changed recently.
It's certainly true that private school leaders told survey researchers that the reason that they didn't participate in the program was two things. One, that the requirement to use the state exam, and two, the requirement to have open admissions. At some point, we have to then say if those things are overly burdensome as a result of getting, in some cases, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in state funding, are those schools really the ones we want to be contributing state resources to? We have far lower standards for all kinds of other private contracting states do for custodial services, for roads, whatever it is, when they're not talking about serving kids. If we're really talking about just sort of here's the check, we're going to walk away, I would just sort of, this becomes a normative question, not a research-based one. I would just sort of say, for my part, I would question whether that's worth the investment for schools that just don't see even those modest requirements as worth their time.
So I just find it interesting, there's got to be a reason in 2014 that, that the data appears to be what it is, and I think we'll probably hear some refuting of that.
It's not as big of a mystery. I mean, in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, the difference between the studies then and the ones post-2013 is that the studies in the 90s and the 2000s, most of the private schools participating were hand-picked by researchers and by, in some cases, the legislatures. And I don't mean that in any sort of nefarious way. This happens all the time in lots of research areas where you go out and you recruit schools to participate as subjects in your study. In this case, private schools joined these teams and said, we'll take 10 kids. And other schools said, we'll take 100 kids, whatever. Those schools tended to be very, very different than the ones that didn't want any part of these evaluations whatsoever. The difference, the thing that happened 12, 13, 14 years ago was that it left the laboratory. It didn't just become a small pilot program in an urban environment where sometimes in that urban environment, due to years of chronic underfunding, the public schools themselves did have some areas to improve on. And so any of the private schools in those areas might have provided some recourse. What happened then is you broke these programs out into these statewide programs. We left the laboratory. You put this thing out into the field, and it was in the field that the failure happened. That's not that uncommon a pattern across public policy. It's just that only on this particular question, school vouchers, do we sort of pretend that it didn't happen. In many, many other areas, I'll give another example, teacher evaluation systems were a hot thing about a decade ago, and they just sort of didn't tend to move the needle one way or the other. They haven't been talked about anymore, at least not routinely as a tool in the education reform book. But teacher evaluation systems had never had the negative impact, at least not on test scores, that the voucher systems did. And the field sort of walked away from those, or at least they're not the hot topic of today. So it really is, in my view, a question of scale. Once these things got bigger, the results got worse. And you can draw a perfect line between the size of the voucher system and the negativity of the results.
Oops, excuse me. Representative Schoolcraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cowen, as I hear more and more, I start getting a little perplexed. I thought, first I heard you were employed at Michigan State. I thought, well, okay, he's representing Michigan State. Then I start hearing about this Education Law Center. Can you tell me about that law center?
The Education Law Center is a nonprofit litigation group that specializes in legal aid on lots of issues. School vouchers is one, students with disabilities another, adequate fair funding, school funding is yet another.
Okay.
That's the organization.
All right, and they're funded by lots of different organizations of people, but I noticed American Federation of Teachers is one significant funder. Southern Poverty Law Center is another significant funder. The executive director was previously with, what is it, the ACLU? Nothing wrong with those, but little by little I'm seeing that's an advocacy group.
Sure.
And then I look at an article on their own website for August of '24. It says, Education Law Center welcomes Dr. Josh Cowen as a visiting senior fellow, adding significant expertise to our ongoing efforts against vouchers.
Yes.
All right. You registered as testifying on behalf of yourself as an expert. Are you saying you're not here representing the ELC?
I represent neither ELC nor Michigan State University, sir.
Right. Then why, okay, I'll just leave it at that.
It's a matter of the public record where I am planted both through May 16th and as a long-term employee at Michigan State, but I'm testifying as an expert on vouchers, sir.
You're an excellent advocate for ELC. Thank you.
I am not here in any role other than to warn you about this bill, sir.
Representative Tallarico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Notice that Representative Schoolcraft didn't refute any of the studies that you laid out. Notice that he didn't make any arguments about the facts that you put before us. The folks pushing this bill get real upset when they're confronted with facts. It quickly becomes ad hominem. And so I apologize on behalf of my colleagues.
Mr. Chairman.
I wanted to have a question about the quality of private schools, because I'm drawing a conclusion from some of the evidence that you've put forward, but I want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. It seems like a through line of some of the results you've walked through is that not all private schools are created equal, that there are some very high quality, incredible private schools, and there are, I think you described them as subprime private schools. And so is it a trend in the data that you've seen that the highest quality private schools either don't have seats or won't allow just anyone to come join that school? And so the voucher money just ends up subsidizing, if at all, subsidizes the kids that are already in that school. And then if there are public school kids who participate who then leave the public school, where they go is the subprime private schools. I know that's a big generalization, but I want to try to figure out if that's a trend that we can identify in the research.
I don't think anyone with expertise in this issue on either side of the question would dispute, for example, that the Louisiana results were driven by subprime schools. Subprime is my word for it, but the other side would certainly tell you that the reason the results were so bad is because the average private school accepting vouchers and participating in that program was not representative of what they viewed as the higher quality of the sector there as well. So there's something about the schools that have signed up historically for voucher payments that has been less than what was promised for kids who transferred.
And in Louisiana, the higher quality private schools chose not to participate?
Higher quality by any measure that we were able to use it. A lot of private schools don't have any way for taxpayers to assess them, but certainly what we would think of as those that charged higher tuition, presumably they were higher quality in some way, they did stay out, yes.
Or reputation?
Yeah, or reputation, sure.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cowen.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Schoolcraft.
Mr. Chairman, I just would point out to my esteemed colleague, my good friend, Representative Tallarico, sometimes I don't respond when I just don't think something's worth responding to. I mentioned earlier that we'll have a book for you with lots of research. It has over 100 studies. It gives you detailed information on how they were created, and you'll be able to judge for yourself whether you know which research you believe. I will say those 100+ studies show this program, various programs around the country do an excellent job, and that's why parents are increasingly choosing to take advantage of them. But we can look at the research that I'll deliver you to also.
Representative Leo Wilson.
Okay, so I'm looking at a tweet that you put out.
Okay.
And you identified yourself with the AFT union. Is that correct? Is that who pays you your salary, or?
I am on a fellowship at the Education Law Center. The AFT is a contributor to the Education Law Center. If your question is by some transfer there, I have been subsidized over the last year by the AFT, I suppose the answer is yes.
Well, I'm
I
just
had some
looking
cold
at
pizza
about-
from them out earlier today too. I went out there and I found them.
Okay. Well, it says on here that.
Hold on just one second.
Okay.
All right. That's actually pretty funny, but it's actually pretty good. That was a good one. But seriously, we're not going to clap. Let's keep it like we were. I hear a little snapping. I'm letting that go. But let's keep the decorum as described in the rules.
Well, I know that you're analyzing the data, right? You're not like the principal researcher here. And so I want to ask you if you also, I mean, just because I'm concerned here, it says, they're about defunding, they believe that vouchers will defund public schools, devastate student learning, discriminate against vulnerable kids. All of the things that we've heard. So, I mean, clearly,
So
there's an agenda there, and so you're analyzing data for an organization that is biased towards the issue that we're discussing. You're not researching it, you're analyzing. Have you also analyzed the data from like 2013, 14 for public schools? Like
yes.
what was happening in the public schools?
Yes. So let me try to, because I appreciate your question. I really do. I understand that it's hard to make sense of this, and there's no question. Like, I am not disputing in any way, and I haven't in any sort of other public setting, that I take a position at this point that is 100% as an advocate against these bills. There's no question. And I said this at the top of the testimony. I mean, I registered against the bill, right? That wasn't always true. And when I changed my mind, and I wrote about this in an entire book that's called The Privateers that was released in September. I don't think anybody can mistake my position on this issue at this point. What I'm telling you is that my position evolved over time as the evidence against vouchers changed from being mildly optimistic and favorable even in some cases to wildly negative. The start date for my fellowship at the Education Law Center post-dates the writing of my book. It post-dates all of the research that was done by myself and many, many others. This is by no means just me here. Many, many other people in the field have contributed to the evidence on vouchers, and I summarize a lot of it. It even post-dates, I mean, the bulk of my funding, if you went to the College of Education at Michigan State University, which is my long-term employer, and you read down the funding list of grants and foundation contributions to my research through 2020, you'll find the Arnold Foundation based in Houston, that was $2 million. You'll find $2 million funded by the U.S. Department of Education while Betsy DeVos was secretary. You'll find Bloomberg Philanthropies. You'll find the Walton Family Foundation, $500,000, not exactly known as oppositional to charters or vouchers. You'll find the Smith Richardson Foundation, also historically a funder of research that was favorable to vouchers and charter schools. So I've been funded over the course of my career through a diverse array of philanthropies, up to and including the point in time when looking at the field of evidence, I, along with many, many others, decided these results are too bad to pretend any longer that the jury is still out, and we need to start saying that these results are awful. And by saying that these results are awful, that moved me from the category of just a researcher who was saying the results are awful, let's wait and see for the next one, to saying we've seen enough. The results have never been this negative on any other research question, and I'm going to say so. And it was by saying so that brought me into this world where, yes, I proudly appeared with folks from the AFT. I proudly work with the Education Law Center until May 16th, and I proudly will say that I think that these voucher systems failed kids and families, and the data back me up on that, ma'am.
Yeah, because you are quoted here saying, I was never a member of a teachers union until now. So
Yeah.
that like you would agree that a researcher is different than a data analyst, right?
Sure, but if to flip that on its head, there's no study that's ever shown favorable impacts of vouchers for kids who've used them that has not come from the voucher advocacy community, and I would include myself in there because at the time of the positive results that I authored in 2013 and then was a research assistant on in 2002, 23 years ago, those were led by voucher advocacy organizations. And so you really can't tell a story one way or the other on this one. But I will tell you that the negative results from voucher systems have come from a diverse array of sources, some from voucher advocacy organizations and others from third-party groups that have just been looking at this and trying to call balls and strikes. But I'm not sitting here pretending to just simply call balls and strikes here. I'm telling you what the data show. And I am here trying to warn folks that the data show these are really harmful.
And what did the data show in that, like the studies that you were comparing in the 2013, 2014 for public school students? What was going on there? Were their scores declining or staying the same? Did you do any comparison between analyzing the research that was being done, at that time with what, the counterpart? How are the public school kids doing as well?
I've written a lot of reports. I don't know that I've ever written one that just looked entirely at public school trend lines over time. School choice has actually been my issue area.
Because we know that NAEP scores have gone down in all states nationally, so that's why I'm asking you the question.
Despite sort of some of the conversation, the direction we're going, like as proud as I am to have sent my kids to public schools, as proud as I am to say these voucher bills are harmful for folks, I don't take the position that public schools have always knocked it out of the park, and I have really tried at various points, including as I've warned about these bills, to identify issue areas in the public sector that we do need to improve on, starting with our support for kids with students with disabilities. The question is, when we have any reform idea, whether it's vouchers or any other reform idea, does it make the problem worse? And the answer to that question when we're talking about these voucher bills is it makes the problem worse. There isn't a pattern of neglect or shortcoming or failure in the public sector that we can describe for public schools that isn't also present in voucher systems, and in some cases, when we're talking about test scores, present in large numbers.
Would you agree that the data, analyzing that, would you agree that the data for kids in that, lower income category have a higher failure rate on test scores, like on state assessments in general?
I would love to get back to a world where the entire conversation was redirected toward how we can improve public school outcomes, particularly for vulnerable children. The answer to that question starts with new investments in those public schools, but we can't really get to that conversation when we're kind of pivoting over toward these new reforms that we've really seen in other states haven't worked very well.
I'm just saying that, as a teacher, and then the end of my career, I was more on the administrative end. And, I would do scheduling for, special needs students who, struggle with the state assessment test, and that would, placed in a teacher's class that would, bring those scores, the total classroom scores for that teacher down because they had a history of failure. So if we're serving the majority of low-income students, and I can't speak to the other states what their target was, but I know we've had some testimony that that is the student population that many of these states started with, either special needs or low-income kids, who both historically do have a pattern of struggling. And so they come in to a private school situation. Was that taken into consideration that these kids have already had a history of failure in the public schools? And so it is a reality, and I just want to know too, if we don't know exactly why that 2013, 2014, what was the reason why they went down? Well, maybe that reason also affected our public school students, and it wasn't the voucher program. I have some questions there on looking at the total picture and analyzing the data for all kids at that time.
I am happy to agree with the statement that all school sectors need to improve their outcomes, in particular for vulnerable children.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Schoolcraft, and we'll go to Representative Cowen.
Dr. Cowen, this gets interestinger and interestinger. Public education. No. You answered the Representative Leo Wilson when she wanted to ask you about an Annenberg Institute paper, and you told her you had never done such a paper. Is that correct?
I said that I have not done an Annenberg paper evaluating DC voucher systems.
Okay. Have you ever done an Annenberg Institute?
I think
Paper?
there's a couple that I've been a part of, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought you were saying you'd never done one for them before. Thank you.
We talked about this. I've got the copy of it. It's a look back at
So
another
some-
study.
yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Just correct the record. So that's,
Yeah.
we're good. We're good on that. All right. Representative Kerwin.
Yes, hi, Mr. Cowen. I just have a simple question.
Yes.
20 years ago, Florida in reading was 34th, and in math was 27th, and this year they're number one in both. How can you explain that?
Some states have spent a lot of time focused on standards of curricula that align very well with NAEP, and I think Florida's been one of them.
Because of the curriculum they chose? Is that correct?
All tests, all standardized tests, including NAEP, have to some extent reflect the alignment of the curriculum with what schools are teaching.
Okay, so you give no credit to the ESA program they implemented?
No. And over the last 3 years, NAEP's declined in Florida as the voucher system's expanded. So if we're going to kind of go in that direction, we should say, well, what's happened as the voucher program's grown?
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Members, any more questions for this witness? All right. Thank you very much for being here.
I appreciate
Thank you
it,
for
sir.
your testimony.
Take care.